The cameras caught every second as White House spokesperson Karoline Leavitt ambushed Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with cherry-picked statistics, expecting an explosive reaction. What happened next left the entire panel stunned. Crockett's calculated response didn't just defend her position, it completely dismantled Leavitt's credibility on live television. The heat in the studio was almost unbearable, but not nearly as intense as the tension building between the two women seated opposite each other at the round table. The Sunday morning political show Capitol Crossfire had promised viewers a civilized discussion on urban development initiatives. What they got instead was anything but civil. Karoline Leavitt, the young, sharp-tongued former White House spokesperson, now serving as a senior communications strategist for the Republican leadership, had spent the morning preparing her attack. Her tablet contained carefully selected statistics, all highlighting what she considered failures in Democratic housing policies. Her target was clear: Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the rising Democratic star from Texas, whose housing stability proposal was gaining momentum. "And now we turn to the housing crisis affecting major cities," said moderator James Kinsey, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of a veteran broadcaster. "Congresswoman Crockett, your Housing Stability Act is being discussed this week in committee. Can you explain how it differs from previous attempts to address this issue?" Jasmine nodded, her expression serious but composed. "Thank you, James. The Housing Stability Act approaches this crisis from 3 angles: affordability, accessibility, and sustainability. We've worked with experts across—" "If I may interrupt," Karoline cut in, a thin smile spreading across her face. The camera caught her leaning forward, tablet in hand. "I find it fascinating that Congresswoman Crockett wants to lecture America on housing policy when the districts most impacted by homelessness are all Democratic strongholds. Perhaps she should focus on fixing her own party's failures before proposing another trillion-dollar government program?" The moderator's eyebrows shot up. This wasn't on the agenda, but confrontations meant ratings. "Congresswoman, would you like to respond?" The panel fell silent. Everyone expected fireworks. Jasmine Crockett had developed a reputation for not backing down from confrontation, especially when ambushed. The producers in the control room were probably already preparing for clips that would go viral by lunchtime. Jasmine took a measured breath. 8 months of research, community forums, and coalition building had gone into her housing proposal. This wasn't the moment to be baited into a soundbite war. "What I'd like to do," she said, her voice steady, "is finish explaining the proposal. Housing instability affects Americans across the political spectrum. My team has worked with Republican mayors in Texas, Georgia, and Ohio who face these same challenges. This isn't about partisanship, it's about people sleeping in cars with their children." Karoline wasn't deterred. She slid her tablet forward, displaying a graph. "These are the homelessness rates in the top 10 American cities, all under Democratic leadership for decades. Your own party's policies have failed these communities. Your bill throws good money after bad." The camera panned to catch Jasmine's reaction, but instead of engaging with Karoline's framing, she pulled out a folder containing testimonials from families who had experienced housing instability. "I have statements here from constituents in Republican districts who are one medical emergency away from eviction. Housing instability doesn't check party registration before it strikes. My bill addresses structural issues that cross party lines." Karoline scoffed. "Classic deflection. The numbers don't lie, Congresswoman." What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of escalating, Jasmine calmly opened her laptop and pulled up a comprehensive study that directly contradicted Karoline's statistics. These figures from the National Housing Institute show that rural and suburban areas have seen the fastest growth in housing instability over the past 5 years. Many of these are in Republican districts. This is precisely why our proposal includes targeted support for those communities as well. Karoline hadn't anticipated this response. She had expected outrage, indignation, perhaps even a personal attack that would make for perfect social media fodder. Instead, she faced a colleague armed with better research and a refusal to make the discussion personal. As the segment continued, Jasmine methodically outlined the key provisions of her bill, linking each to specific challenges faced by communities across America. She mentioned collaboration with Republican Representative Michael Thornton, a conservative from a rural district who had co-sponsored a key amendment to the bill. Karoline attempted several more provocations, each more pointed than the last. "Your party's obsession with urban voters has left Middle America behind," she charged. "This bill is just another example of coastal elites dictating policy to the heartland." But Jasmine remained focused on substance, refusing to be pulled into the spectacle Karoline was trying to create. When the segment ended, viewers had received a masterclass in policy discussion rather than the political theater they might have expected. Behind the scenes, Jasmine's phone was already buzzing with messages. The contrast between her substantive responses and Karoline's transparent attempts at provocation had not gone unnoticed. Several undecided representatives had reached out, impressed by her command of the issues and her refusal to be baited. What Karoline didn't know was that while she had been preparing attack lines that morning, Jasmine had been on a call with 3 moderate Republican senators who were considering supporting a companion bill in the Senate. The confrontation on Capitol Crossfire had just made their decision easier. As the crew reset for the next segment, Karoline stood nearby, already crafting tweets to spin the exchange in her favor. But something unexpected was happening online. Clips of Jasmine calmly dismantling Karoline's arguments with facts and research were already trending, not the gotcha moment Karoline had planned. The green room buzzed with activity as production. Assistants darted around with coffee and last-minute script changes. Karoline glanced at her phone, her expression hardening as she scrolled through the comments. This wasn't how the narrative was supposed to unfold. She had planned for Jasmine to lose her composure, to give her something explosive to reference in upcoming press briefings. Instead, word facts over fiction was trending alongside clips of Jasmine's measured responses. 2 minutes until we're back, called out a floor director, clipboard in hand. Karoline slipped her phone into her pocket and straightened her blazer. The second segment would focus on budget implications, her territory. She had come armed with talking points about fiscal irresponsibility. This time she wouldn't let Jasmine control the conversation. As they returned to their seats, Jasmine was deep in conversation with the economic correspondent who had joined the panel. She didn't even look up when Karoline took her seat, which somehow made it worse. "Welcome back to Capitol Crossfire," the moderator began. "We're continuing our discussion on the Housing Stability Act with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and former White House spokesperson Karoline Leavitt. Joining us now is Dr. Martin Weber, chief economist at the National Fiscal Institute." Before the moderator could pose his first question, Karoline jumped in. "I'd like to address the elephant in the room," she said, her voice carrying a practiced urgency. "We've heard a lot about the what of this proposal, but very little about the how. The Housing Stability Act comes with a $380 billion price tag over 5 years. Where exactly does Congresswoman Crockett propose this money comes from? More taxes on hardworking Americans? More debt for our children to inherit?" The moderator nodded, turning to Jasmine. "Congresswoman?" Jasmine had anticipated this line of attack. Rather than immediately responding to Karoline, she addressed Dr. Weber directly. "Dr. Weber, your institute conducted an independent analysis of our funding mechanism. Would you mind sharing your findings with the viewers?" Weber nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Our analysis found that the proposal's funding comes primarily from closing real estate tax loopholes that currently benefit only the wealthiest 0.5% of property owners. Additionally, it redirects funds from existing programs that our research has shown to be ineffective. The net impact on the federal budget is actually positive by year 3. Karoline felt her advantage slipping. She hadn't expected Jasmine to have secured independent economic validation. That's convenient analysis from an institute that receives funding from progressive donors, Karoline countered, though she had no evidence to support this claim. Dr. Weber's eyebrows rose. The National Fiscal Institute has advised both Republican and Democratic administrations for over 30 years. Our funding is transparent and nonpartisan. The camera caught Karoline's momentary flash of uncertainty before she regained her composure. The American people don't want more government programs, she pivoted. They want freedom from government interference in the housing market. This bill is a solution in search of a problem. Jasmine finally turned to face Karoline directly, the first time she'd engaged with her opponent rather than the substance of the discussion. Ms. Leavitt, I've spent the past year holding town halls in communities devastated by housing speculation, predatory lending, and corporate bulk purchases of single-family homes. I've met veterans sleeping in their cars, nurses who can't afford to live in the communities they serve, and seniors forced out of homes they've owned for decades. With all due respect, telling these Americans that their crisis isn't real shows a profound disconnection from what's happening across this country. The studio fell silent. Even the cameramen exchanged glances. Karoline sensed the shift in the room. She needed to regain control. Emotional appeals don't change fiscal reality, Congresswoman. Your proposal would destabilize housing markets and create dependency. Actually, Dr. Weber interjected, our economic modeling shows the opposite effect. By targeting specific, market failures rather than imposing broad regulations, the proposal would likely increase housing stock by 12% in affected areas within 3 years, while decreasing price volatility. The segment continued with Jasmine methodically addressing each criticism with evidence and expert validation. What had been intended as an ambush was turning into a policy masterclass, with Karoline increasingly relegated to the sidelines of her own planned confrontation. During a commercial break, Karoline felt her phone vibrating repeatedly. Messages from party leadership were pouring in, asking why she wasn't landing any effective blows, why the conversation had shifted to policy details rather than political point scoring. One message from her communications director was particularly blunt. This is becoming a PR problem. Change tactics now. As the cameras prepared to roll again, Karoline decided to abandon policy critiques entirely. If she couldn't win on substance, she would shift to character. She had been saving a personal attack as a last resort. Something about a potential conflict of interest involving Jasmine's former law firm and housing developers. The claim was tenuous at best, but it might be enough to knock Jasmine off balance and change the narrative. The red light on the camera flashed back on. The moderator turned to Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, you wanted to respond to the Congresswoman's point about community impact? Karoline leaned forward, her expression serious. What viewers should know is that before coming to Congress, Representative Crockett's law firm represented several of the very developers who would benefit from this legislation. One has to question where her true interests lie. A murmur rippled through the studio. This was the moment Karoline had been waiting for, the soundbite that would dominate coverage. She watched Jasmine carefully, expecting signs of shock or defensiveness. Instead, Jasmine smiled slightly and opened a folder she had kept closed until now. I was hoping you might bring this up, Ms. Leavitt, Jasmine said calmly, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness Karoline had anticipated. Since you've chosen to make unfounded allegations about conflicts of interest, I'd like to share some facts with our viewers. She removed several documents from the folder and handed copies to both the moderator and Dr. Weber, while sliding one across the table to Karoline. These are public ethics disclosures filed when I first took office. You'll note on page 3 that I completely divested from my former law firm precisely to avoid even the appearance of conflicts of interest. Additionally, I've recused myself from any votes directly impacting former clients during a 3-year cooling-off period, despite not being legally required to do so. Caroline's eyes darted over the document, searching for any weakness, any loophole. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, turning to the camera with a composed but firm expression, the Housing Stability Act explicitly prohibits preferential treatment for any developer, regardless of size or political connections. Section 12, Paragraph B creates an independent oversight board with members appointed by both parties. The moderator reviewed the ethics documents, nodding slowly. These appear to be in order and quite comprehensive. Dr. Weber was already scanning through his copy. If I may add, Congresswoman Crockett consulted our institute specifically about implementing safeguards against the very concerns Ms. Leavitt is raising. The bill contains some of the strongest anti-corruption provisions I've seen in housing legislation. Karoline felt the ground shifting beneath her. This wasn't just a defensive response. It was a counterattack executed with surgical precision. Jasmine had anticipated this line of attack and prepared accordingly. Well, questions still remain about, Karoline began, but the moderator cut her off. Before we continue with that point, Ms. Leavitt, I think it's important to note that making unsubstantiated claims about ethics violations is quite serious. Do you have any evidence contradicting the Congresswoman's disclosures? The camera zoomed in on Karoline's face. The silence lasted only seconds but felt eternal. My point is about the appearance of impropriety, not technical violations, she finally said, her voice less certain than before. I appreciate your concern for appearances, Jasmine replied, which is why I've gone beyond legal requirements in my disclosures and recusals. Transparency matters to me, but so does substance, which is why I'd like to return to discussing how this bill will help Americans keep roofs over their heads, rather than engaging in personal insinuations. The studio audience, silent until now, broke into spontaneous applause. The moderator, sensing a pivotal moment, didn't immediately silence them. When the applause subsided, Jasmine continued. The Housing Stability Act isn't perfect. No legislation is. But it represents months of coalition building, research, and compromise. We've incorporated feedback from across the political spectrum. Because housing instability doesn't care how you vote. It affects families in red states and blue states alike. She turned to face Karoline directly, her expression not triumphant but resolute. Ms. Leavitt, I invite you and your colleagues to engage with the actual policy. Propose amendments. Identify weaknesses. Help us make this legislation stronger. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about scoring political points. It's about whether Americans can afford to live in their communities. As the segment wrapped up, the damage control texts flooding Karoline's phone went unread. Party leadership was watching the same broadcast as everyone else, witnessing what political commentators would later call a masterclass in policy defense and political grace under pressure. 3 days later, the Housing Stability Act passed, its first vote in the House subcommittee with unexpected bipartisan support. 2 moderate Republicans crossed party lines, citing the bill's fiscal responsibility and strong anti-corruption provisions. In their statements, both specifically mentioned the thorough and transparent approach demonstrated by the bill's sponsor. The media narrative shifted dramatically. What had begun as coverage of a political confrontation evolved into analysis of the legislation itself. Editorial boards across the country, regardless of political leaning, began examining the housing crisis with renewed interest. Local news stations ran segments on housing instability in their communities, many featuring the statistics and research Jasmine had cited during the broadcast. Karoline wasn't fired from her position, but her role was subtly diminished in the weeks that followed. Party leadership privately concluded that her confrontational approach had backfired, drawing attention to a Democratic policy initiative that might otherwise have received less national coverage. Her attempt to make the story about personal conflict had instead elevated the substance of Jasmine's work. 1 month after the Capitol Crossfire showdown, Jasmine was invited to speak at a housing conference in a deeply conservative state. The invitation came from a Republican governor who had initially opposed the legislation, but after studying its provisions, became a cautious supporter. In private conversations, he admitted that watching Jasmine defend her work with such thorough preparation had convinced him to actually read the bill rather than dismiss it along party lines. When Jasmine arrived at the conference, she was surprised to find Karoline in attendance as well, representing a conservative think tank focused on housing policy. Their first encounter since the televised confrontation was awkward but civil. "Congresswoman," Karoline said, extending her hand, "I'm here as an observer for the Marshall Institute." Jasmine shook her hand firmly. "I'm glad you're here. Critical perspectives make legislation stronger. That's actually why I wanted to speak with you," Karoline said, her voice quieter than the confident tone she'd used on television. "Our research team has identified some potential unintended consequences in Section 8 of your bill. It's not fatal to the legislation, but it could create issues in rural implementation." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "I'd like to hear more. My team is meeting in the conference room at 4. Would you join us?" Later that afternoon, as Jasmine's staff took notes on Karoline's concerns, an unexpected collaboration began. It wasn't friendship, and they would never agree on fundamental political philosophies. But in that moment, substance prevailed over spectacle. 6 months later, the Housing Stability Act passed with amendments that addressed the rural implementation issues Karoline had identified. In the final vote, 17 Republicans joined Democrats in supporting the legislation, a rare moment of bipartisanship in an otherwise divided Congress. When President Matthews signed the bill into law, both Jasmine and Karoline were present. They stood on opposite sides of the Oval Office, still representatives of different political visions, but both acknowledged in their own ways that governance sometimes requires putting aside the performance of conflict to address the problems Americans face every day. As Jasmine left the White House that afternoon, a reporter called out, "Congresswoman, do you consider this a victory over your critics?" Jasmine paused, considering the question carefully. "This isn't my victory," she replied. "It's a victory for the family that gets to stay in their home, for the essential worker who can afford to live in the community they serve, for the senior who doesn't have to choose between medication and rent. Those are the only victories that matter."